Well, it means perhaps we could be a little bit more lax with time for your questions. But I guess we better get started.
Could you let me pull up my
Oh, yeah, sure.
notes, please?
Sure. Are you plugged in there?
I am.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah. That's...
It seems to be live, so...
So you've been at Smith College a long time? About 40
Yeah,
years.
in terms of speaking.
That's a long time.
Can you put the PowerPoint presentation up there?
Yeah,
I can use it from there.
Oh, okay.
What I'm going to do here is
Smith
my
40
notes
years, and then we moved to
So-
Boston about 7 or 8 years
All right.
ago.
Yeah.
No,
We're a little bit over time, so let's get started already. My name is Bryce Wakefield. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come here and listen to our event today. Today's event is webcast, so if I could ask everybody to turn their cell phones off, that would help us immensely, because the cell phone signals tend to interfere with the technology that we have here. Before we get started, because we are being webcast, I'd like to say a few words about the Woodrow Wilson Center, to perhaps tell people about the center who may be watching who don't know about it. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is the living national memorial to President Wilson, who was the 28th President of the United States. It was established by Congress in 1968 and is headquartered in Washington, D.C., as you all know. The center commemorates the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson by providing a link between the world of ideas and the world of policy, and fostering research, study, discussion, and collaboration among a full spectrum of individuals concerned with policy and scholarship in national and world affairs. And the intent of Congress when they founded the Woodrow Wilson Center was, unlike a lot of the presidential memorials that you'll see up and down the mall, the intent was to create a living memorial where scholars could come and engage in research about policy and other areas. Okay, we have a very interesting event today. It's on ethnic politics policy issues in Taiwan, and we've got a range of scholars from all over the academia to discuss this issue. I'm going to introduce each scholar in turn as they stand up to speak. And our first scholar is Melissa J. Brown. She's an assistant professor of anthropology at Stanford University. Her work has explored minority identities and borders as a tool to understand Han Chinese identity. And she's the author of Is Taiwan Chinese? The Impact of Culture, Power, and Migration on Changing Identities. And also Explaining Culture Scientifically, both published in 2004. So if we could all give a hand to Professor Brown. Thanks. Would you be able to pull the microphone towards you?
Yes.
Thanks.
Trying to... Sorry.
The full screen is down the bottom. If that's,
Yeah.
there we go.
Okay. So, I'm going to talk a little bit today about the ways in which people make assumptions about ethnic identities and how those feed into national identities, and false assumptions that people make, how those play into ideologies, and then switch to thinking about, well, what is it that underlies ethnic identities and national identities, and what kind of implications does that have for helping us understand the situation in Taiwan? So one of the things that I want to start with is the idea that there's a lot of very real kinds of identity-based politics and movement going on in Taiwan. These photos are from 2008, the fall of 2008, just before and during the visit of Chan Yunlin from the People's Republic of China to Taiwan. He's the senior negotiator for the People's Republic of China. And as you can see from the one slide where there's English, Taiwan yes, China no, the gentleman with the characters on his body is saying, oppose communist bandits and Taiwan independence. The woman in the lower left has a Taiwan a Democratic Progressive Party flag, often also associated with the Taiwan independence movement, and you can see how many people turned out for protesting Chan's visit. Estimates range to upwards of 500,000 people. So what's going on here, and how is this related to identity? I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about this. I believe one of the later speakers is going to talk about it in more detail, but the idea of whether people in Taiwan think of themselves as Taiwanese or Chinese or both has fluctuated a great deal in the past 10 years or so. This is data from 1992 to 2007, and you can see the blue line at the top, which stays more or less constant, are people who claim to be both Taiwanese and Chinese. The green line that goes up are people who say that they are Taiwanese. The red line going down are people who say that they are Chinese. And then, of course, there's a percentage at the bottom that are unclear. So these kinds of figures lead people to assume that the political issues that are going on, the demonstrations, come in some kind of natural way out of ethnic identities. So what are the ethnic identities that are in Taiwan, and how might they help us understand what's going on? Currently in Taiwan, the ethnic groups get broken down into two major categories. The first is a Han category, the people that those of us in the United States and in most of the West think of as ethnic Chinese. The Chinese term for them is either Han or Hua, sometimes other terms as well, but primarily one of those two. And within Taiwan, that includes Hoklo, Hololang, people who are Minnan speaking, mostly from whose ancestors are mostly from Fujian province. Hakka, who are also from southeastern China, their ancestors from that area. Hoklo and Hakka came to Taiwan, their families came to Taiwan before 1895, which is a significant date, and I'll get to why in a little bit of time here. And then there are mainlanders, people who came with Chiang Kai-shek's forces, nationalist forces, mostly between 45 and 49, whose families came from all over China. The other major category are the indigenous peoples, or aborigines, and these are generally broken down into two groups, the so-called mountain peoples and the so-called plains peoples, which appear to be geographic terms, but actually are terms, polite forms of the terms that were distinguished in the late imperial period, distinguishing between Sinicized aborigines, the plains peoples, and those who had retained their own languages and culture and were considered quote-unquote wild, the mountain peoples. Now, given all of those different identities, it's hard to see how they come together neatly into a so-called Taiwan or Taiwanese national identity. And one of the things that upholds and that highlights is something that I have looked at in my own research, and that is, what is identity based on? There are a lot of false assumptions that people commonly make, both popularly and even within the scholarly literature, that identity is based on culture or ancestry. And these are ethnic identities, racial identities, national identities. People make assumptions that these are based on culture or ancestry. And they also assume that that such identity can be indicated by reliable markers, such as clothing, in the past foot binding, eye or nose shape, skin coloration, spoken accent or dialect, religion, surname. These are all things that people have assumed were reliable markers. As I'll talk about, they're problematic. Another false assumption is that identity cannot change, that it's a primordial thing, that it's a characteristic of your birth, and whatever you're born with, you have for life. These kinds of assumptions come from ideologies, and they play into ideologies. And by that I mean a partial or selective use of information, right? Usually used to benefit people in power. And ideologies about identities, particularly about identities as fixed, are often used to mobilize a group. They can be used by political activists for trying to get rights for that group. They can be used for nationalism, and they're often used for justifications for inequalities and as motivations for warfare. So, if these are false assumptions, what then are identities really based on? In my research, one of the things that I found is that identities are definitely linked to a label, a name like Taiwanese or Chinese, and they are claimed by culture or ancestry. And the Chinese term here, 中华民族, is something that has been used on both sides of the Taiwan Strait to talk about what we might call in English the Chinese nation, but Chinese in the sense of it's ambiguous about state or nation or ethnic, and it very much draws on Han. The zhong in the first character is for China as a state. The hua is for Han, is for the ethnic Chinese people. It's actually a term that infuriates minorities on both sides of the strait because it tends to exclude them. So identities are then claimed in these terms of culture or ancestry, but in fact are based on social experience. And this is something that I've done a lot of work on. And I can give you more of an explanation in the question and answer period if you'd like about what I mean by social experience, but a sort of simple rule of thumb for thinking about it is that it's how you and others like you are treated, both now and in the past. So, for example, in Taiwan, the 228 incident, the February 28, 1947 uprising by people in Taiwan against the KMT, the nationalist rule, led to a suppression of Taiwanese, to casting them as second-class citizens, which had a very galvanizing effect, not only on Taiwanese who were alive at the time, but also for subsequent generations, because they were aware of the experiences that their family members had had, and it had lingering implications for the entire 40 years of martial law. So these are ways in which social experience then shapes people, because these kinds of labels affected who people labeled as Taiwanese could marry, what kind of jobs they could have, and a series of other things. So one of the important things then about social experience and its basis for identities is that social experience changes over time. It changes within an individual's lifetime, and it changes over generations. Moreover, it's negotiated constantly. People jockey to maintain or improve their social position. This is something we see in many parts of the world. It's not unique to Taiwan or China. And they move to try and create or expand their social networks. Moreover, social experience can be shaped by political policies. One scholar in the People's Republic of China who has worked with ethnic minorities made a comment, something to this effect, to me once, where he said, you know, in Chinese minorities, we tell them what they are, and after a while they get used to it. And his point was that because the Chinese government's labels then affect the life, affirmative action benefits, which affects school, for example, and the number of children you can have, that given enough time, people come to have the identity, even if they didn't have it previously, because of the way it's affected their social experience. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but the point I want to make with this slide is that because social experience is shaped by political regimes and by political policies, the different experiences of political regimes in China and Taiwan since 1600, and the differences between those are significant. So if you just take a quick look down, first of all, you can see that Taiwan's had a lot more regimes than has been the case in China, and also that they've been very different. The overlap primarily comes in the Qing period between 1683 and 1895. Now, 1895 was significant because at that point, Taiwan was ceded to Japan as a colony. And so Taiwan spent the period from 1895 to 1945 as a colony of Japan, during which time Japan greatly developed Taiwan's economy. It industrialized, it introduced a number of public health measures that essentially eradicated malaria, tuberculosis, and plague. And that led to, a series of other changes in terms of reducing mortality, the beginning of the demographic transition to people having fewer children, just a whole host of things. In 1945, as the nationalists, the Chinese nationalists, the Kuomintang, were losing the civil war in China, they retreated to Taiwan and brought with them a whole bunch of mainlanders, and shortly after, because of the 228 incident in 1947, instituted martial law, approximately 40 years of martial law. This gave Taiwan a very different experience of politics, of stability, of expectations than what was happening in China at the same time. In 1949, of course, the People's Republic of China was founded, and they embarked first upon a Maoist period of collectivization, leading into the disastrous Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and finally, after Mao's death, starting in 1978, the beginnings of the present reform system, which has brought them to market socialism. So these kinds of very different political policies and political regimes have had an impact on the social experience of people on both sides of the straits. There's a whole host of these kinds of experiences, and certainly don't have time to go into all of them, but I want to pick on two for each side of the strait and just highlight them. So in China, in the People's Republic of China, there have been state-mandated youth rights. And at the level of ordinary people, who are those that I work among, one of the earliest and most far-reaching was the states granting young people the right to veto marriages. Their marriages could no longer be arranged entirely by their parents in meeting the person they were going to marry for the first time on the wedding day. They, by law, had the right to say they did not want to marry a certain person. Also, one of the things that developed was, over time, and this has been more important recently in the reform period, are young people's abilities to get independent jobs so that they were not reliant upon their parents for providing them with a livelihood necessarily. One of the things this has done is undercut the traditional kinship labor system, particularly in rural areas. And that has had profound consequences for social experience of ordinary people in China. Another thing I want to point out is the issue of travel restrictions. For a variety of reasons, both economic and political, most people in the People's Republic of China, most ordinary people, have had very limited experience with travel outside of China. And one of the important implications of that is that their worldview, their concept of what it means to be, for them to be Chinese to other people, is largely based on the ideologies that they get through the education system, political system, etc. By contrast, 2 points I want to highlight for the Taiwanese experience is that ethnic differentiation among the Han was a big factor for Taiwanese at 2 points, particularly during the martial law period, where, as I mentioned before, Hoklo and Hakka, who were together often called Banshangren, or Taiwanese, it is usually the term given in English for that concept, became second-class citizens after the 228 incident. And this was something that came up in daily life with the experience, for example, of people being fined for speaking Taiwanese language in public places. Young people in schools at the beginning of every school year, academic year, having to stand up for their class and tell the entire class the province of origin of their father, which immediately identified them as Taiwanese or mainlander. Now, that second-class status was greatly reversed with the transition to electoral democracy, which began in 1986, took 10 years, and has been fully in place since 1996, because all of a sudden Hoklo and Hakka, who together combine to be about 85% of Taiwan's population, suddenly they weren't second-class citizens anymore. They were the majority constituency in elections. And they became courted rather than being denigrated. Moreover, Taiwan's economy has improved tremendously since the Second World War, and as a consequence, even ordinary people have quite a bit of wealth in the sense that they're able to travel. I work in poor rural villages, and even many of the elderly people I've interviewed in poor rural villages have had the opportunity to visit places in Southeast Asia. Bali is a frequent destination, or the Philippines. And of course, wealthier Taiwanese travel in the US and in Europe as well. One of the things that this has meant, many people in Taiwan also use this to travel to China. And one of the things this has meant is that they have experienced during their time in China that they're treated differently than Chinese, than PRC citizens. They're also treated differently than other non-PRC citizens. So they're treated differently than foreigners from the United States or from Europe or from Australia, etc., or other places in Southeast Asia. They also have experienced in other parts of the world what it means to be Taiwanese. So for many people in Taiwan, their worldview is very cosmopolitan. It's experience-based, either their own experience or the experience of someone they actually know. And that has big implications for how they understand themselves and their place in the world. So the take-home message that I want to leave you with is that these kinds of social experiences mean that Taiwan identity is real. It's not just a political ploy, which is something that you'll sometimes hear accusations of. And moreover, one of the things is that it does influence people's responses to policy decisions. So the identity and the reality of the identity don't tell us what the policies ought to be, but they do say that whatever policymakers decide, they need to take this identity into consideration because it will affect ordinary people's response to what's going on, and that's how they wound up with 500,000 people on the streets of Taiwan before Chen's visit in 2008. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Brown. Our next speaker is Megan Greene, and Professor Greene is an associate professor of history at the University of Kansas. Her field of study is the history of the Republic of China under the Kuomintang, both in China and on Taiwan, and she specifically focuses on science and the economy, academia, and ideology. She's the author of Taiwan's Past, China's Future, which was published in the spring of 2008, and she's also the author of Taiwan in the 21st Century, Aspects and Limitations of a Development Model.
I should actually probably correct my book title, which was originally going to be Taiwan's Past, China's Future, which I thought was a great title, but that got relegated to the title of the conclusion. So it's actually now The Origins of the Developmental State in Taiwan. Partly because there's not all that much China content in the book, so it might have been a bit of an inappropriate original title. Ethnicity and education in Taiwan is what I want to talk about, and I want to thank Melissa for her presentation, which set up so many ideas that I want to address here, and I hope that I am able to build out of this. And I'm realizing right now that I'm quite short. Suddenly, I feel like I can't quite see everybody. But so my main point, the main thing that I want to discuss today, or to observe, is that in Taiwan in the 20th century, and I'm thinking particularly the latter half of the 20th century, and then into the 21st century, governments have attempted to use education to shape identity and, by extension, ethnicity in Taiwan. So this is a project that has been undertaken both by the KMT government and by the DPP government, which was recently ousted. To define a few terms, and I've got a few slides here up front that have some words on them, and then mostly I'm going to pictures. To define a few terms, when I'm talking about ethnicity, I guess what I mean is social groupings that have a shared history, identity, culture, or geography, but actually I'm not going to talk about ethnicity as something real here. I'm going to talk about ethnicity as something that is being constructed, or that states are attempting to construct. When I deal with education, I'm not simply talking about the school system, although that's part of what I want to discuss. I also will be mentioning, showing you quite a few slides of images that I took from museum displays, for example. So education is something that's happening, and the state-sponsored education is something that's happening not solely within the walls of schools, but it's also happening in museums, in public spaces. There are various ways in which the state is trying to educate its people to think of themselves along certain lines. And I'm going to really focus on two particular periods. The first is the sort of later martial law era, in other words, the 1960s to the 1980s, and this is a sort of a loose period in my talk. And then the DPP era, the period from 2000 to 2008. Now, during the martial law era, the KMT state undertook a number of educational strategies for shaping ethnicity. And these were largely defined by a sort of wholesale effort that Melissa has already alluded to reconstruct Taiwan as Chinese and to reconstruct the people who lived in Taiwan as Chinese as well. So this was, and I guess I should clarify here that I'm not entirely sure whether these goals were always achieved, right? So what I'm talking about here are goals and not necessarily results, although I think anecdotally, certainly, there's ample evidence to suggest that this was relatively effective in the martial law era. Whether it was effective later on remains to be seen. So reconstructing Taiwan as Chinese. So teaching only Chinese language in the schools, in other words, forbidding the use of other languages, Taiwanese, Hakka, Japanese. Teaching Chinese history as opposed to teaching a history of Taiwan. So the history curriculum throughout the martial law period was very much China-centered. Introducing the population to sort of high Chinese culture to the extent that it was something new to the Taiwan population, and it was not necessarily entirely new. And then, of course, the renaming of everything with China. Now, this image, which can you see the words in the center? It says it might be translated as "I'll only speak Mandarin. I'll only speak the national language, and I won't speak a dialect." Right? And this is the kind of sort of guidance that students were being given, typically, constantly in schools. Right? So schools were demanding this of people. This image, by the way, comes from a really peculiar place that I think is still open. That's located in central Taipei. It's a museum / theme park called Taipei Storyland, and it is dedicated to kind of showing people what Taiwan was like, or what Taipei was like in particular in 1965. So that's picked as a year, an interesting year. Let's recreate 1965, and so it's sort of useful if you want to then go back and try to, if you don't happen to have been in Taiwan in 1965, as I wasn't, and don't have a cache of photographs, go to Taipei Storyland and you can find some. Which is what I did, more photographs from Taipei Storyland. So we also have textbooks being used, and the classroom more broadly being used in order to construct notions of Chineseness. Now, KMT period, so martial law period, history textbooks very much celebrated the sinification of Taiwan in the 17th century and then again in the 20th century. So that to the extent that Taiwan ever appeared as a subject of study for students in middle school or high school, it was always in the context of how it became Chinese. right? So we don't, well, and there was the brief, bit about how Taiwan became Japanese, but that wasn't dwelt upon for very long. So there's, a short chapter on what happens in the 17th century when the Chinese, when the Qing, when first Zheng Chenggong and then the Qing take Taiwan. And the emphasis in this textbook treatment of Taiwan's history is on the Chinese, the making of Taiwan, or the remaking of Taiwan as a Chinese place. So its institutions became more Chinese, its religious and cultural practices became more Chinese, it became more linguistically Chinese, and so on. And these ideas are very much embedded in the narratives of Taiwan's history, that, small though they are, that are part of the larger Chinese history textbooks that students would have been exposed to during this period. In addition to educational, standard sort of like textbook type treatments that one might find in classrooms, there were other kinds of institutions that were created, such as the National Palace Museum, which was built in the mid-1960s, and as probably most of you know, houses a wonderful collection of Chinese artifacts, right? And so the kind of public displays of history that were being made available to people so that they could learn about themselves, were by and large Chinese displays. And then, I'm sorry about the granularness of this. I grabbed it off the web. This is another institution. It's Little China, I guess, would be a good name for it in English. Where Taiwanese can go, or actually can still go, and see sort of images of the Forbidden City, images of little miniature replicas of these spaces, these places in China that they are meant to be associating themselves with if they've studied their history well and if they've grown up thinking of themselves as Chinese, and that they until the late 1980s and 1990s never would have had an opportunity to see for themselves. And then we have probably the most glaring example of a kind of public space that has an odd, but in some ways, intentionally Chinese kind of look about it, right? The JunkiShek Memorial, which I think now is called that again. Is that right? In central Taipei. It had a brief time when it was not. Now, moving on to the 2000 to 2008 period. Educational strategies for shaping ethnicity in the DPP era bear many similarities to those that were being employed by the KMT in the martial law period. The one big difference, though, is that they really drew upon diversity in order to shape unity. So this is something that I think is really an odd phenomenon. Drawing upon diversity of Taiwan's cultural history in order to shape a unified notion of Taiwanese ethnicity. What's even odder, though, perhaps, about this phenomenon is that the DPP government did not draw upon the obvious ethnic diversity that one might, that Melissa was just talking about, the sort of the presence of peoples who might have associations that are in some ways narrower or somewhat distinct from Taiwanese or Chinese who reside in Taiwan, Hakka, for example, or people of various Aboriginal groups. Rather, they're drawing upon a kind of a multiculturalism of Taiwan's past, and I'll get to that in a moment. So they did this by teaching in a way that really emphasized Taiwan's history, right? Taiwan's rather than China's. Teaching multiple languages whenever possible in schools. Celebrating the diversity in Taiwan's past, and then through renaming processes also. Now, I thought I would just give you a map, and I'm going to do something with this map in a moment, which is something that the Chen Shui-bian administration, the DPP administration, was interested in seeing done. They wanted the people of Taiwan to begin to reorient themselves in terms of how they thought about the origins of culture in Taiwan, how they thought about the historical relationships that Taiwan had. And they made the argument, the Minister of Education, Du Zhengshang, made the argument that if the image on the map that people see of Taiwan always has China looming over it, in that corner, then that's problematic. China's always present. It's always noticeable. And then this has an impact on the way in which people think of themselves and the way in which people think of the connections they have. So he proposed a reorientation of this map. Now, if I had done this very skillfully, I would have managed to get the words to come out right side up. But I couldn't do that. So he would have done it in a much more sophisticated way. But my unsophisticated version puts China down at the bottom, right? It locates Taiwan in a different way, and suddenly, our eyes are drawn to all of that blue that surrounds Taiwan, and our eyes are drawn up into the corner to more blue, right? So we begin to think of Taiwan as a place that is connected through the oceans, through the seas, to the world, and that maybe China is sort of peripheral. It's down there on the bottom. So this very simple reorientation of a map can sort of represent a mental reorientation that the DPP government was very much trying to get into the classroom and also into museum spaces. A major effort that was undertaken during the DPP period was to reconstruct the high school history education curriculum, and this was done with the idea of placing Taiwan at the center, right, and peripheralizing China, making China. Taking it out of the center so that Taiwanese students, when they opened a history textbook in high school, would no longer first encounter China, but they would now first encounter Taiwan. So the idea is a concentric circle notion, right, as we can see here, with Taiwan at the center. And this is the curriculum. This curriculum was hotly debated for several years, but it was finally implemented in 2006. The idea was that Taiwan's history would occupy the first term of 4 terms of high school history education. The second term would be dedicated to China, and the third and fourth terms would be dedicated to the world, to the study of world history. Now, the idea of having an entire term on Taiwan's history at the high school level was sort of mind-boggling, I think, to many high school history teachers who could not imagine that they could possibly come up with enough material to do this, because they had never had to do it before. But they did, they were sort of compelled to do this. New textbooks were created, a new curriculum that they needed to follow was initiated. And although I think that there have probably been many teachers who have chosen to truncate the Taiwan history portion a little bit and have a bit more for China's history, nonetheless, a lot more students are getting exposure to Taiwan's history through this new curriculum. Okay, great. To say just a little bit more about that Taiwan semester of the new curriculum, it's divided into 4 broad periods. The first is a focus on Aboriginal cultures of Taiwan up until the multicultural 17th century. So it ends with the 17th century, and the 17th century is very explicitly described in this curriculum as being a multicultural period. Then this is followed by the Qing period, from the late 1600s up until the late 1800s, then the Japanese colonial era, and then contemporary Taiwan. So there are 4 units in this term, and the Qing period is but one of 4, right? So that the other units really are focusing on periods during which Taiwan was not under Chinese control. And again, this narrative is very much aimed at getting students to think of themselves as Taiwanese, and to think of Taiwan as having had a distinct history from China. Now, in museums, there's also been a sort of celebration of Taiwan's multicultural past and a celebration of the colonial eras of the past. So that there have been numerous, or were at least during this period, numerous exhibits available in public spaces, and these are museums controlled by the government, that emphasize this multicultural 17th century, that look at the Dutch, the Chinese, and the Aborigines living together in this sort of harmonious way, and yet all of them different. The treaty port era also figures largely, and the Japanese era. And what I want to do now is run quickly through some images of some of these exhibits. Most of these were up in about 3 summers ago. So there was this one that was located actually in the basement of the JunkiShek Memorial called Once Upon a Time in Taiwan. And we see here a little plaque, in which we see that if you look at the second line, in 17th century Taiwan, there was a large international market that was the playground of many Dutch, Chinese, and Japanese traders. What kind of idea do you get there? You get an idea of an incredibly vibrant, international, cosmopolitan place where there's all sorts of stuff going on, and all these people living there and interacting and connecting with each other. In the same exhibit, we were introduced to what a Dutch house of the 17th century would have looked like. Not that there were really any Dutch houses in Taiwan, but that's beside the point. There were Dutch people. What a Chinese house would have looked like, and what kinds of things might have been there. Sorry, that's my extra slide. And then this actually comes from another exhibit, because I somehow could not find any of my images of the Aboriginal house. But we have other exhibits elsewhere that are showing that sort of thing. In yet a different exhibit, we have images of footwear that people were using in the 17th century. We have a Dutchman located in a fort, a renovated fort that is now being used as a museum in the city of Danshui. This is Fort Santo Domingo, which at the same time, since it had been the British consular residence in the treaty port period, is also celebrating the Victorian era, right? So that the seating in the cafeteria of this place, which is all new, it has these references to Queen Victoria. And this is, very much a celebration of the internationalism of Taiwan's past. Likewise, and I just have about 20 more seconds here, we have a celebration of the Japanese colonial era, restoration in certain areas of Japanese colonial buildings, and of Japanese colonial businesses. So here we have a gold mine that has been restored in parts, not to function as a gold mine, but as a museum. And more shoes. That comes back to that other exhibit. And then of an American presence as well in the post-war period that we can see in certain kinds of exhibits. And I'll leave us with Jasmine, whose father comes from San Francisco, who also demonstrates to us that Taiwan is multicultural even today, right? So that as Taiwan and as the DPP government are trying to construct or were trying to construct notions of a Taiwanese ethnicity, they were drawing upon these very global references in Taiwan's past that were explicitly not Chinese. And trying to inform the Taiwanese people that they were who they were partly because of the influence of the Dutch, the British, the Japanese, and so on. Thank you very much.
Great. That's okay. Great. Thanks, Liam. Our next speaker is Emerson Niou, who is a professor of political science at Duke University, and his current research projects include studies of institutions and reforms in China. He's the author of several academic articles and has published on Taiwanese independence. Thanks.
First of all, I have to tell you a little bit about my background. I am from Taiwan, so that's the first confession I have to make. Because I'm not sure whether that's a rice bag. The last slide or the soybean bag. I remember I was born in 1958, so my mother sent me to a Catholic kindergarten, primarily so our family could get some soybean or some kind of this kind of foreign aid ingredients from the U.S. So that brought back a very fond memory of my childhood. People from Taiwan, once I revealed that I was born and raised in Taiwan, immediately, people from Taiwan would turn on all the senses, say, gee, he's kind of tall. Is he a mainlander? And someone's nodding his head, And so if he's a mainlander, then he must be a Pen Blue, the KMT supporter. Then he must be for unification, It's must not be supporting Taiwan independence. So I get used to this, this kind of people. People probably don't ask you those questions up front, but you can see that they are picking up the signals and trying to reach some conclusions, right? So today I will give you a presentation using some survey data, to study why people from Taiwan, they care about identities so much, all right? The identities are created to serve some political purposes, all right? And identities are needed because Taiwan and China are currently governed by two different governments, all right? In Taiwan, we talk about Taiwan independence, but the deeper question is, independent from what? Are you trying to be independent from the Chinese culture, Chinese identity, or you're trying to be independent from the Chinese government's control? You're trying to be independent from the Chinese communists? All right? If independence means independent from the PRC's government, then I would say 100% of the people in Taiwan would support independence. But then once you move down, the layer, you're trying to be independent from the Chinese identity, Chinese culture, or what? Then people will have different preferences, different identities. All right? So I'm going to use some, first of all, what's going on here? So, yeah, sorry, thanks. Michael knows this well. Like you see these kind of ads everywhere. A new constitution, a new name for the country, and to protect Taiwan, to safeguard Taiwan. You need a new country, new constitution. Some people in Taiwan are big advocates and supporters of this idea, right? And some foreigners also try to interfere Taiwanese politics. A bunch of foreigners. So this country is Taiwan. Republic China has vanished. So you see a lot. These political symbols are very, very controversial, contentious in Taiwan, and this is a new. And because the KMT and the CCP now are shaking hands and hugging each other, the implications of that. What are they doing there? How come they're hugging and shaking hands? And so people are trying to draw implications from all these signals. But anyway, so I think that there are four main identities and two fairly salient issues in Taiwanese politics. Right? The ethnic identity, I call that cultural identity, national identity, and party identification. And the independence issue and the Taiwan's current trade relations with China. All right? So let's go over these identities and these salient issues to understand how Taiwanese label themselves, identify themselves on these dimensions and these issues. So the data I used actually was conducted by the Election Study Center of the National Zhengzhou University, and Duke University paid for all these surveys. Since 2003, it's an annual survey, all right? And today I will use the 2008 survey conducted in February, all right, in my presentation. So just give you some background. Then, and I will need to ask you to read the slides faster and faster, all right? Because Bryce will hand me the time reminder very quickly. So because after 1992, all right, on the identification card, it stops recording your birthplace, or not birthplace, your father's birthplace, all right. So today we cannot go to the government to get the distribution of the ethnic distribution. So we use survey data. We ask them, what's your father's where is your father's birthplace? All right, and that's the distribution. Right? Hakka, Minnan is what we call Taiwanese, the local Taiwanese, and the mainlanders. So so that's the rough distribution. Right? Remember, it's a survey result, so this, given the size of the survey, there's a 3% margin of error here, right? And the cultural identity, whether you are Taiwanese or you are Chinese or you have dual identity, you are both Taiwanese and Chinese. And you can see there's a fairly significant change, right, from 2003 to 2008, all right? And there's more Taiwanese, more people who have dual identity in 2003 actually now believe they are only Taiwanese, right? And more people who believe they were Taiwanese in 2003 actually now also believe they are Taiwanese. All right, so there's a shift, about 10% shift. And the percentage of people in Taiwan believe they are Chinese only are going to become extinct very soon. All right, and there's a significant change. So, the political slogan or campaign theme, Taiwan first, there's a reason for that, because more than 95% of the people in Taiwan believe they are Taiwanese. All right, although 55% of them believe they are also Chinese. All right. And the national identity, right? And I had this question. I didn't have this question in the 2003, but this year, in February, I included this question in the 2008 survey that is asking people, this is how the question was phrased. Some people say that Taiwan is already an independent country and its name is the Republic of China. Do you agree or disagree with this point of view? Right? And roughly 75% of the people in Taiwan still believe that Taiwan is independent, its name is the Republic of China. Right? And 25% disagree. Right? And the party identification, the blue and the green, right? The pen blue, pen green. Remember, this survey was conducted in February 2008, so because of Ma Ying-jeou's effect, so maybe there's some exaggeration here. Right? Because after 2000, after 2004, actually the DPP, people identify with the DPP percentage was a lot higher. All right? So the party identification distribution fluctuates a lot in Taiwan. But this gives you a rough idea that in 2008, this is. And on the Taiwan independence issue, you probably have seen this kind of frequency table a lot. This is what we call the. Roughly, we try to divide respondents into three groups: those who are willing to express their preferences for either independence or unification, and those who are reluctant to reveal their preferences. All right, the people in categories 3 and 4, maintaining the status quo indefinitely. What does that really mean? and maintaining the status quo now and deciding what to do later. So these two groups combine over 60% of the people. All right, are either reluctant or they don't know. But the important question to ask is, under what conditions they will be willing to accept unification over independence? All right, and that's a very good research question. But I'm going to leave that to Steve, but I'm just going to move on, all right? So these are the distribution of people's preferences on the Taiwan independence, this issue. And to just see the next, this means something, all right? Because Taiwan independence is such a salient issue, but if you ask respondents whether they find independence or unification an objective they can be achieved, very few people. It's a 11-point scale. So people who gave 10, 9, 8, 6, 7, 6, they are more optimistic about the likelihood of achieving the goal. All right? Doesn't matter whether people are for independence or unification. Many of them actually don't think it can be achieved. All right? So preference is one thing. Reality is a different thing. It's kind of cute because you do the checking. Some people say, I'm for independence. But do you think independence can be achieved? Probably not. All right? But that's probably another reason why so many people are trying to preferring maintaining the status quo, because they don't know what will happen in the future. All right? And another question is whether increasing trade with China is a good idea or not. All right, we have a question in the survey, asking people whether Taiwan should increase trade with China. Choosing between wealth and security. Right, it's a trade-off between security and wealth. Right, and so that, let me, since we have now 2 dimensions, just give you. So this 64% means those who believe that Taiwan should increase trade with China, all right? And about 21% do not want Taiwan to continue to increase trade. Now this distribution, by row is those who prefer independence, all right? The distribution among those who prefer independence, 33% would like to increase trade with China, but 51% do not like to see an increase of trade, all right? Those who would like to maintain the status quo, 70% would like to see the increase of trade. All right, those who want to unite with China eventually, about 90%. All right, so the distribution horizontally, they add up to 100%. All right, and this number here means this dimension, that's the aggregate distribution. Let's examine the cross-cutting of these 2 identities, ethnicity and cultural identity. Again, okay, I know I'm asking you to recap. So about 41% of the people consider themselves Taiwanese only, right? I showed this slide to you before. And about 55 consider them who have dual identity, all right? And those, let's say Minnan, all right, the Taiwanese. 46% of the Minnan Taiwanese, they think they are Taiwanese only. All right, and 51% have dual identity. And the mainlanders, 21% consider themselves Taiwanese only, and 66% have dual identity. So you can see there's a correlation between the ethnic identity and cultural identity. But the 2 identities do cross-cut. Right? If you get tired, I can skip some slides. And how about ethnicity and their preferences on the independence issue? Right? So again, yeah, all right. So Minnan, all right. So you can see that mainlanders, well, not that much different, huh? But some difference, right? But you can see that Minnan, more than a quarter of them, the only acceptable option is independence, right? But mainlanders, it's only 7.5%, right? And ethnicity and party identification. Again, Minnan already? All right. So mainlanders predominantly are Pan Blue supporters. That's not very surprising. Among the Minnan group, about 39 Pan Blue, 30% Pan Green. All right. And the national identity also, there's a very strong correlation between the ethnicity and the national identity. Right? So the Minnan always have a strong, larger group, either supporting independence or not willing to accept Republic China as the national title. Right? That's a higher percentage of the people in that group. Again, not surprisingly, those people who consider themselves Taiwanese only, 45% only accept independence, as the option, prefer independence as the, and about 50% prefer maintaining the status quo. And those who consider themselves, those who have dual identity, then 74% would like to maintain the status quo. All right. So let's move on a few slides. Yeah. So main findings. Right. These are the main three points I could come up with this morning. So yes, there are several salient divisive issues in Taiwan. The independence issue especially. But the cross-cutting identities, using the survey data, show that although there are very contentious, divisive issues in Taiwanese politics, but the Taiwan society is not divided because the identities cross-cut, right, each other. Right? They don't reinforce each other. And the second point I want to show is, given that more and more people in Taiwan identify themselves as Taiwanese only, or both Taiwanese and Chinese, so for the DPP, and not surprisingly, its central campaign theme has been to portray itself as the only party that will protect Taiwan's interests, and the KMT is the party that might sell out Taiwan to China. All right. And the DPP, for example, on May 17, the DPP plans to stage another demonstration, and the slogan is to rebuke Ma and to protect Taiwan. So the DPP is the party that will protect Taiwan. That implies the KMT might be a party that will sell Taiwan to China. And the third point is, for the KMT, its challenge or strategy is to convince Taiwanese that it's more open and close trade relations with China will help Taiwan's economy, right, and without hurting Taiwan's national security. But I think exactly how the KMT should do to make that policy to convince Taiwanese that the opening up Taiwan to China economically will not endanger Taiwan's national security. I think that's a challenge that the KMT has to face. I mean, in my head, I feel like Taiwanese have this kind of fear. That is, we are reaching out, right? We are either opening door or reaching out to shake hands with or hugging and shaking hands with the Chinese leaders. But we don't know whether they are really, good guys, or they might try to put us over, right? We are reaching out our hand to shake hands, but they are maybe sneaky people and might put us over, all right? So somehow the Mandarin government has to find a way to tie, use a rope, tie up its waist and convince Taiwanese that, we have some safety, measure. And so Taiwan will be able to negotiate with China with more confidence. Right? I think the U.S. might play some role, should play some role here to provide some kind of assurance to Taiwan's government. So Taiwanese will not have this fear that, hey, we might be pulled over by China. They're trying to eliminate Taiwan, liberate Taiwan eventually. That might be their political objective. So while Taiwan is opening up its market, Taiwan needs to find a way to ensure Taiwanese, that this will not run the risk of hurting Taiwan's security. All right, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Emerson. Okay, our next speaker is Stephen Goldstein, who is the Sophia Smith Professor of Government at Smith College. His current research focuses on relations between the mainland and Taiwan, as well as the evolution of US-Taiwan relations. And he has recently published Presidential Politics in Taiwan, the Administration of Chen Shui-bian, which he co-published with Julian Chang. Great. Okay.
Well, I guess I get to go last, and it's good news and bad news. The bad news is that I felt I was in some kind of a Looney Tunes cartoon, sitting there with my notes that I was pulling out one page, pulling out the next page, moving another page. A lot of what has been said I had intended to cover, so this is going to be some fast improvisation. That's the bad news. The good news is that I get to go last, and going last, I get to try to answer the so what question. You've learned a lot about identity, a lot about party alignments, but now the question becomes so what? And what I'd like to do, take as my brief or as my task, is to talk about the relationship between identity and future relations with the mainland. That is how the identity question figures into the preferences of the Taiwan people for relations with the mainland. The first thing to say is that for a country of 23 million people, Taiwan is probably one of the most politically polled places in the world. It seems to be heaven, not only for American pollsters, but for Taiwan pollsters. And as soon as the opportunity is right and Shun Mingming in Beijing can get over to Taiwan, I'm sure that Mingming will be also polling Taiwan. And one of the really leading pollsters has been Emerson Niou. And I will, in fact, today draw on some of his work. But what I want to do is I want to try to bring together for you the current survey data that exists on the question of exactly how identity and attitudes towards Taiwan's relationship with the mainland figure in, or how the two coexist. Now, which one of these will move slides? Is it this?
Yes, you have to open first. So open your...
Do I have myself? Yes. Okay. I see. All right. Good. So, I'm an amateur at this.
From beginning.
From the beginning. That makes sense. Okay. And then Good. This is the question that I'd like to explore today. And it's very simply, what impact does the decline in the number of citizens of Taiwan who identify themselves exclusively as Chinese, or and the concurrent rise in both those who identify themselves as Taiwanese as well as Taiwanese and Chinese have on attitudes regarding the options for future relationship between Taiwan and the mainland? That's the question. Now, some attempt at the answer. This you've memorized by now. This is an objective indicator, presumably, of identity in Taiwan, and this is the famous trend chart that we all use. And as Emerson and also the other speakers have shown, what you have here is both Taiwanese and Chinese as of the end of last year at about 41%. Taiwanese has gone up to about 51%, and exclusively Chinese has declined. That's a reality. What's interesting is the fact that in each case, for example, if you talk about mainlanders, mainlanders have seen an increase in dual identity. Taiwanese have seen a dramatic no, this is mainlanders, sorry. Mainlanders have seen an increase in dual identity, a decrease in exclusive Chinese identity. On the other hand, there has been a dramatic decrease in exclusively Chinese identity for native Taiwanese, Bunchongren, and a rise in both Taiwan identity, but also both. So as we've seen, if you do identity by origin, the trends are basically very similar. If you do identity by age, then there's something very interesting. As you might expect, the pre-war generation, that is the people who are on the island during the Japanese occupation, very strongly identify as Taiwanese. The baby boomers, the 36 to 55, less so, but still strongly, 42%, and the E generation, the young people, the people who have had the education, many of them that Megan Greene talked about 41%. But what's also interesting is that this, and we're going to focus on this generation, the younger generation, they have they have this percentage of 54.4% consider themselves to be both Taiwanese and Chinese. That's dramatically more than the pre-war generation, which only about 30.2% considered themselves that. Now, what's the effect of this? Well, or what are the expectations? So, so far what we've established is that Chinese identity has declined, Taiwan identity has clearly increased, but so also has Chinese and Taiwan identity across both groups. Chen Shui-bian's conclusion in 2006 was very clear. Taiwan consciousness is growing, and that is going to be the basis for Taiwan's independence or Taiwan's separation from the mainland. And as Megan argued, that was put into practice both in the educational system as well as outside of the educational system. The People's Daily in Beijing came to the same conclusion, basically, one of the few times they agreed with Chen Shui-bian. They argued that Chu Zhonghua, which is de-sinification, which was how they referred to the educational program, is all a part of the independence program that Chen Shui-bian was trying to promulgate. So we come now to really crux of the issue. Has this change in the nature of identity, increasing Taiwan identity, and also increasing dual identity and a decline in Chinese identity, has that resulted in a broader commitment of the people of Taiwan to an independent posture from the mainland? Or just to leave the question open, what has it led to? There's no question that as far as the people of Taiwan are concerned, the mainland is not very friendly. This is a Mainland Affairs Council chart that shows hostility towards the government and hostility towards the people. These are numbers that came out just a few days ago, and they're basically in line, but what they show is that since Chen Shui-bian, clearly, since Ma Ying-jeou's election, clearly, I very rarely confuse those two, since Ma Ying-jeou's election, clearly, the sense of mainland hostility has gone down. But if you look at the pace of cross-strait exchanges, you can see the uneasiness that Emerson Niou reflected. About 47.5 think it's just right, 37.2% of the people think it's too fast, and only 4.5% think it's too slow. So there is, certainly there's not a lot of love or a lot of trust, let's put it that way, on the island for the mainland. So the next question becomes, how does that affect the future? And of course, this is the famous 6-point chart that Emerson referred to. And these are the options. Unification immediately, status quo now, and unification later, status quo now, decision later, status quo indefinitely. Now, in April of 2009, that is this month, figures were released that show that status quo indefinitely has reached its highest point since 2001. That's interesting, and we can talk about why that's the case. But this is the same chart basically showing that this is status quo in terms of public opinion. And the conclusion is that 84.7%, 85% of the people of Taiwan want to maintain status quo with different endpoints, but still maintain status quo. That's a very important thing to keep in mind when one talks about the future. Now we get to this guy, Emerson Niou, and some of his research. And this is just basically to show you a different way, which is, again, part of an electoral survey that's been done for years of Taiwan. It's a series of conditional questions, which he briefly mentioned. These are asked, do you agree that if peace can be maintained, Taiwan should be an independent country? 47.6 agree. Second question is, if mainland China and Taiwan become politically, economically, and socially compatible, do you agree that the two sides should unite? Again, favorable conditions for each of these outcomes. What if under the best of all worlds we could have each of these outcomes? Now, in the Niou and Xie study, this is how it came out. But what is interesting is this 22.7% of the people that find both acceptable. Both acceptable. Keep that in mind. This is a different study. And what this study finds is in 2005 that 30.6% or 31% of the people found both acceptable. Finally, a more sophisticated series of questions or a more nuanced series of questions has been done by Julian Han, and he has the same two questions, but he has created a whole series of people. Open-minded rationalists agree with both. In other words, whichever is fine with them, either independence or unification, if the conditions are right. That's what he calls an open-minded rationalist. He has those who lean towards opinion, lean towards independence, and those who will not accept unification under any circumstances are principled believers in independence. And then he has those who are principled believers in unification, who would disagree, who would agree with unification under the right circumstances, but disagree with the independence under any circumstances. Julian Han then comes up with this interesting final set of figures. What he finds is that 30.6% or 31% of the population are what he calls open-minded rationalists. That is, people who under the right conditions will accept either. On either side are a series of weak opponents, and so one could argue, if one wanted to, that you've got about 34% who are in the middle, who are conditional. Let's see how things work out. And at the wings, the principled believers in the independence and those who lean towards independence are at 32.6, and those who are principled believers in unification or lean towards unification are about 16%. So the center of gravity lies with those that he calls open-minded rationalists. The final slide, which I think is one of the most interesting, he then asks the question, how is this distributed by generation? And lo and behold, the generation that has been subjected to the Chen Shui-bian educational system, the generation that has grown up during the democratization of Taiwan, who have been most exposed to the concept of Taiwan identity and Taiwan nationalism, contains the largest number of open-minded rationalists. In other words, those committed exclusively to independence are in the older generations and are, in many cases, literally dying. Now, what do we conclude from that? And let me suggest 5 conclusions. The first conclusion is a negative finding. The growth in Taiwan identity and the growth in dual identity and the decline in Chinese identity has not led to a call for independence on Taiwan. Secondly, second conclusion, in the spectrum of public opinion on Taiwan, status quo is the dominant theme. It has been, it continues to be, and in fact it's even growing stronger. And we can question perhaps why that's the case. Third thing that I think we can conclude is that neither the advocates of independence nor the advocates of reunification have a majority. And so any politician has to consider both. Fourth conclusion is that the balance is with whether you want to call them pragmatists, whether you want to call them rationalists. They are the ones in the middle. They have the swing vote, and they will and have thrown themselves back and forth to influence outcomes, and will ultimately influence the final outcome because they are the young folks. They're the ones who are growing up now. Fifthly and finally, I think we have to ask the question, why? How do you account for the fact that the most intensely educated, that generation that has been exposed to the most free discussion of the nature of identity, the nature of Taiwan's history, how do you account for the fact that they are in that category of open-minded rationalists? And there are many explanations that people try to come up with, but I think that the predominant explanation, or the consensus explanation, is the attraction of the mainland, is the fact that mainland China is a place where it's happening. And the number of Taiwanese who are going to the mainland for education, for business, are all growing. The number, I think, is growing. And so you can argue that opportunity, the magnetism of the mainland, has certainly been one very important factor in shaping what is a very interesting situation and continues to be a very interesting situation regarding the interplay between identity and attitudes towards the mainland on Taiwan. As I said when I began, for an island of 23 million people, Taiwan has some of the most fascinating politics in the world, and I think this is just one good example of it. Thank you.
Okay, great. If you'll join me in thanking all of our speakers with a round of applause. Okay, and we now turn to questions, and because we're being webcast, if you'll please raise your hand, and one of our microphone carriers will come around and hand you a microphone. If you could please identify yourself by name and any affiliations you might have, that would be good too. Okay, so first question I believe will be down here.
Glenn Beyer with WITA. This is a question for Stephen Goldstein. Do you predict any impact by the unveiling of China's nuclear subs this past week on Taiwan's identity? And the second question is for Megan Brown, and it's do textbooks in Taiwan and mainland China have any different perspective on Japanese incursions into China? Thank you.
Submarines. The parade of Chinese ships at Qingdao this week, which was part of the People's Liberation Army Navy 60th anniversary. I don't think it will have any real impact on the identity issue or on attitudes towards the mainland. If it has any impact, usually mainland threats backfire, and mainland threats increase the sense of hostility of the people of Taiwan towards the mainland. I think that was the experience in '96. I think Emerson Niou has done some research where he's tried to look at variables like the threat from the mainland or American assistance and how that conditions the response to those 6 questions, so he may want to come in. The parade of submarines, though, I think will affect American perceptions of the Taiwan issue. I think this was the first time that the Chinese showed this number of nuclear submarines, and I think Chinese submarines in the Pacific are a matter of concern to the Navy because their primary role is to interdict American forces that might intervene in Taiwan should there be a conflict. I think that's where the impact might be felt.
So that's a really interesting question that you asked, and I wish I had a really good answer to it. In other words, I haven't actually looked at that, but I will now that you've suggested it. I can say that representations in textbooks in Taiwan, in contemporary Taiwan, representations of the Japanese colonial era are relatively positive. So that while there's a discussion of resistance, Taiwanese resistance to Japanese Japanese efforts to take control of Taiwan, there's a fairly a positive narrative of what then happens later under Japanese control, that Taiwan develops, it modernizes, it industrializes, it becomes more sanitary, and so on. And all of these things are noted in the textbook treatment. I have not looked at all to see how then, if there's any kind of a contrast in the way in which the Japanese attack on China, which would have occurred while Taiwan was a Japanese colony, exists. You know, is there any kind of conflict between these views? I don't know. My expectation would be that there would be a more benign description of that than what you would find in PRC textbooks, but I can't say for certain.
Great.
Michael Fonte, I'm the DPP's Washington liaison. Just a couple of points. I think that for Taiwanese that I know anyhow, the feeling of being second-class citizens didn't start with 228. I think it started before that, was part of the reason for the explosion. It's a historical footnote that maybe it's challengeable, but I think that's probably true. Also, when you list under Han Chinese the various Holo, Hakka, many Holo people feel, again, whether the DNA shows this or not, that they have an ama, a grandma somewhere back there who was one of the Aboriginal people. So you got a little bit more of a mixture. But I guess what I really want to ask at this point is, from any of you, what you think is happening today with what I think the DPP feels is a attempt to re-sinify Taiwan. President Ma, in his inaugural speech, said we're all Zhonghua Minzhu, Donghua Binzok, and has gone on to rename the Democracy Memorial back to JunkiShek Memorial, went to Jiang Jingguo's 100th birthday party, because he had been, of course, secretary to Jiang Jingguo. And more recently did something which even I find strange, which is that he went to the Huangdi's celebration, the Yellow Emperor, as a founder of the... So it seems to me that there's an attempt to re-sinify Taiwanese under this rubric that President Ma has used of a one China umbrella, and I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Melissa, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. First, I want to say something about the second-class citizen issue. Certainly, people in Taiwan, Taiwanese saw themselves as second-class citizens under the Japanese Empire. The Japanese made that very clear. But there's also a lot of evidence that the way in which that they thought of themselves as second-class citizens was as Chinese, not as Taiwanese different from Chinese under Japanese rule. And it really wasn't until the nationalists came over and all of a sudden the Chinese were treating them as second-class citizens that you get this birth of it, not only as second-class citizens, but as an identity that's distinct from China as well as from Japanese. And as far as the issue about Hololang, of Hoklo or Minnan people thinking that they have a huge percentage of Aborigine, both genetic and cultural ancestry, I have a student who just finished his PhD dissertation who went and looked at the genetics of this. And this is the big hot topic in Taiwan independence right now, saying that, well, Taiwanese are actually, you get figures from anywhere from 60 to 90% Aborigine, and so this is why we really shouldn't be considered Chinese. But the genetics doesn't support that. The genetics of Southern Taiwanese, who are Southern Taiwanese Han, who are the ones who are most likely to be admixed with indigenous peoples, look exactly like the genetics of people from Fujian. So now you can't tell if the indigenous component in the southern Taiwanese Han is from indigenous peoples of Taiwan and therefore and distinct from the indigenous peoples of Fujian. That at this point can't be determined genetically, but it's exactly the same percentage, and it's not as high as everybody's claiming. So that claim that Taiwanese are 90% genetically Aborigine isn't true. As far as the issue of the attempt to re-sinify, I mean, I think one of the problems here is the conflation in English and in notions of sinicization or sinification about Chinese citizenship, Chinese national identity versus an ethnic or a cultural heritage. And one of the things that people often forget and that when they talk about is Taiwan Han in that sense, does it have Han ancestry? Does it maintain essential elements of what has been part of Han culture for centuries, particularly things like ancestor worship and other aspects that have always been salient to that, is that yes, Taiwan has maintained those things, but China didn't. So you can see differences culturally between China and Taiwan, but it's not because Taiwan hasn't maintained traditional Han elements of Han culture. China didn't. China got rid of ancestor worship in the campaign to get rid of the Four Olds. And some people have tried to bring back their ancestral tablets and reinstate the worship, but it isn't the same and it hasn't taken off in the same kind of way that has been maintained in Taiwan. So the concept of how culturally Han or Chinese is Taiwan is far more complicated in that sense in terms of you see continuities to elements of Han culture in the late imperial period, definitely, but it's maintained elements that China hasn't. And when you look at what's happening in the contemporary cultural scene, that gets even more complicated as well because, of course, there's all this back and forth across the straits. And there are elements of Taiwan popular culture that have been introduced into China and vice versa. So part of what I was trying to say in terms of the social experience is that I don't think pulling apart the culture is going to help us try and figure out why people are doing what they're doing. It's got more to do with issues that relate to people's actual experience of it. And in that sense, I think the young people's sense that either would be okay does have to do with more of them having this cross-strait experience and being in China, and that has an impact on it. I don't know if anyone else would care to comment on this.
I just want to say that Taiwan is a democracy. I don't understand why you are confused why Ma Ying-jeou is doing all that. He was elected, all right? He has his supporters, all right, to satisfy. And just like Chen Shui-bian, he did certain things to please his supporters, to represent his supporters. Ma Ying-jeou is doing exactly that. It's a democracy. And in 4 years, let's see whether the KMT will continue to be in power. And politicians do things to gain votes in a democracy. Very simple.
Okay.
My name is Adriana Cao, and my question goes to both Dr. Niou and Dr. Goldstein. Considering that there's such a big percentage of Taiwanese who are open-minded and rational as pragmatists, and taking the example of Hong Kong as a region, quasi-independent, specially administered region, and of course their background, which was culturally, governmentally, politically different because of the British rule. Taking that as an example, do you know of or do you think that offering SAR conditions to Taiwan would be viewed by the Taiwanese public and the Taiwanese government as favorable conditions to accept that title, so to say? And I think we all know that Hong Kong still maintains a lot of their uniqueness, and they don't call themselves Chinese, really. They very much go with Hong Kongese. So taking that as an example, do you think that Taiwan would be in a position similar as Hong Kong?
You can go first.
I don't have any survey data to support what I said, but I think probably 2%, 1% of the people might support that. Any politician making that kind of proposal will be committing suicide. You know, that's not acceptable. You know, it's. I mean, we can label those 30-some% of the Taiwanese as rational, or we can call them just opportunists. You know, this reminded me that the relation between Taiwan and China for the first 40 years, very similar to the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba. But now Taiwan's relation with China is much like the Puerto Rico's relation with the U.S. You know, Puerto Ricans, they were given a choice to choose to become independent or become a state of the United States. They chose not to choose. They want status quo. So just like Taiwanese, you know, I'm not going to choose. Very much like Puerto Ricans, you know, I'm not going to make a choice. Maintaining the status quo serves my best interest. You know, so let's see how this will play out in the future. But right now, I think Taiwan's relation with China is a little bit similar to this Puerto Rico's relation with the U.S.
Yeah, SAR and one country, two systems are simply non-starters for the overwhelming majority of Taiwan. And I don't think there will be serious discussions over a relationship until the mainland is ready to go beyond those kinds of formulations. It's just unacceptable. It's just not going to work.
Great, there's one up the back there.
I'm senior correspondent for Voice of America. I have questions for the participants of today. Do you know, as we noticed that Chen Shui-bian's corruption case will tarnish the image of DPP party, do you think this case will affect the people that identify them with the person who claimed he's the son of Taiwan? And then I agree with Professor Niou and Professor Goldstein and other people that I'm from Taiwan. You know, I watched Taiwan. I was Taiwan beat correspondent for Voice of America for a while. So I noticed, I agree with them, 85% want to be the status quo. On the one hand, they want to keep with relation with China on the commercial matters or some cultural matter, but on the realistic side, they want to keep a certain, distance with China. How do you comment on that?
Does anybody want to comment on this?
Well, I think that's probably the case, and I think that's what status quo represents. They would like a commercial relationship. They would like that to grow. If you look at the polling data on Ma Ying-jeou's policies towards the mainland, he's generally doing much better in terms of easing commercial relations with the mainland than he is in practically any other field. So that's a consensus issue. Though again, the DPP has managed, as Emerson showed, the DPP has managed to raise doubts about the benefit cost ratio between an economic agreement with the mainland, seeing it as one more step towards being swallowed by the mainland. But I think that's slowed Ma Ying-jeou a little bit, but I don't think it'll stop him. I think there's still considerable sentiment for the economic relationship, at least.
I don't know. Again, because I'm from Taiwan, so emotionally I am attached to that place. I just hope that the party politics, competition in Taiwan, like this political slogan, I Taiwan, you have to love Taiwan, but it's a loaded expression. How do you love Taiwan? Do you have to hate China in order to show you love Taiwan? All right, is that the implication? All right, who are Taiwan's true enemy? Not Chinese people, not in my opinion. You're afraid. We have fear. We are afraid of the Chinese government. All right, that's why we are reluctant to be united. But to show you love Taiwan, does it have to imply that you have to hate China? So show that you are really pure. And I think that I do not want to see that kind of momentum develop and gaining strength in Taiwan. It's okay. Of course, you have to love Taiwan. But the implication shouldn't be you have to hate China to demonstrate you love Taiwan. Right? That's just a personal view. Right?
My name is Youngwan Keo, visiting scholar at Georgetown University. And I got the impression from Professor Niou and Goldstein that whatever Taiwan is going through today, obviously Taiwan is one of the successful cases of democratic transition, and you are paying more or less difficulty in terms of pressure emanating from mainland China. So my question then would be two. Number one, assuming that democratic Taiwan or China, rather, in Ireland will continue, let's say in the next 4 or 8 years, is there any kind of expectation on your part that Taiwan can provide some influence on mainland China in terms of change of regime or liberalization or opening of society? That's the first question. The second question has to do with Taiwan defense, ROC military. I understand from another session that I recently attended that Taiwan has adopted the American version of a QDR, defense review, quarterly defense, quadriennial defense review, rather. So what is the implication of that in line with what China and, let's say, Taiwan needs to get along in terms of military and security matters? Thank you.
Okay. I would, on the first question, the impact of Taiwan on democratization in China. Democratization and how democratization occurs is one of the great complex questions. And my sense is that democratization occurs when leaders are democratic. Democratization is pull from above rather than push from below. I think that's been a pretty universal experience. So whatever Taiwan might be able to do in terms of influence would not, I think, really change the mentality of the Chinese leadership. If change is going to come, it'll be from above. And Taiwan's influence, I think, will be minimal. Secondly, on the defense issue, I think Ma Ying-jeou has made it, and this is, of course, part of the political predicament that he's in. Ma Ying-jeou has made it very clear to the people of Taiwan that he will only negotiate with the mainland from a position of strength. And so he is committed to a certain percentage of the budget going to defense. I think he continues to be committed to trying to obtain F-16 CDs from the United States. And I think that he's going to continue to press for the withdrawal of mainland missiles, 1,500 facing Taiwan. He can't seem weak because that will hurt him too much politically. He has to show strength. And the mainland has to understand that. And if it creates a security spiral, that's unfortunate. But I think that's his political need.
Yeah, me.
Yeah, I just wanted to. I can't actually address the question of democratization in terms of whether there will be an influence of Taiwan on the PRC. But there are ways in which the PRC government has picked and chosen from amongst strategies that governments in Taiwan have used to develop Taiwan. And that suggests to me that the PRC government actually does look at what's going on in Taiwan, not simply with alarm, but also as a place that might actually produce viable models. So that if we think of things like industrial science parks that Taiwan implemented, and the PRC picked up this idea and ran with it and has taken it to a different order of magnitude. Various other kinds of things along those lines that are aimed at fostering industrial development. And high-level sort of scientific development, there is no doubt in my mind, but that the PRC government has very explicitly looked at and adapted and adopted Taiwan models. So the possibility exists that there might be something in Taiwan's political model that would be viewed that way. I'm not holding my breath, though.
Can I just add a few words? I mean, I think 20-some years ago, Deng Xiaoping said China will become a democracy in 50 years. But it's, I mean, their understanding is like democracy or non-democracy is like turning on the light switch. 50 years is up. Okay, let's turn on the now we have to. No, you have to prepare for it, right? You have to carry out political reforms to become more democratic, right? But I mean, this year China is celebrating the 30 years of reforms, but China lacks political reforms. Right? That's a fact, and it's a kind of ironical. Chinese leaders, I think, are a bit too complacent, right, because of economic growth and this and that. But there's a actually negative relationship between economic performance and political urgency to carry out political reforms. When economy is doing great, leaders don't feel the crisis or urgency to carry out reforms. So in China they say stability supersedes, overwhelms. It's the most important objective, right? Let's not have political reforms. But like Lao Tzu, right? He said you have to 置之于未乱. You have to govern before it becomes chaotic. To make sure, so it won't become chaotic. When it's become chaotic, it will be too late to govern, right? And so China should begin. I hope the Chinese leader will think about how to, if they are sincere about this, becoming a democracy, they should begin to pave way for that, all right? And, I just haven't seen any breakthrough in that area.
Okay. One more question.
Thank you. One more question, and again in relation to the whole status quo, because it just permeates everyday life for Taiwanese. I'll just throw this out there, and I know that I'd appreciate your opinion. How long do you realistically believe that the status quo can be maintained? Maybe it'll be longer than our lifetime. But I feel that with all the changes that the whole world, including Taiwan, the older generation dying off, so much more interchange between Taiwan and China daily, just how long do you see the status quo being sustainable?
That's
Or maybe is the status quo sustainable? might be an easier question.
That's a political decision that has to be made by both the mainland and by Taiwan. The mainland could very easily run out of patience in terms of being able to, in terms of a leader on the mainland being able to maintain his or her position while at the same time Taiwan being separate from the mainland. There could be domestic problems, there could be many kinds of events that might lead a leader or a group of leaders to say status quo, in other words, no independence but no unification, is no longer acceptable. So the mainland will have to stay patient. Taiwan will also have to stay patient and accept what is a reduced international profile, less than sovereign status in the world. If something changes on the island and there's a president that perhaps is more radical than Chen Shui-bian was, and the issue gets pushed for whatever reason, though it would be politically very, very difficult, I think, then that could end the status quo. Status quo requires tolerance and patience on both sides. And if you consider that Ma Ying-jeou's position is that unification can be considered when the mainland becomes democratic and reconsiders the events at Tiananmen, it's going to be a long time. So I think that's where I would leave it.
Okay.
Patience.
Okay.
In a sense, this brings up allows me to bring up a point I wanted to make. I think there's an elephant in the room that we've been ignoring, and that's Chinese nationalism. I've done in-depth interviews of farmers in poor rural areas in both Taiwan and in the People's Republic of China. And the issue that I find that comes up in China with, ordinary farmers, low-ranking officials, people who, genuinely have these sentiments but are not the movers and shakers of government. Whenever they find out that I've done the amount of work I have in Taiwan, they want to know all about it. They want to hear what it's like. And then the conversation always goes to, but Taiwan is part of China and it must be returned to us. I mean, there's this very strong nationalism that, will enter into decisions of Chinese government leaders about what they have to do and why. They don't have firm control over that nationalist sentiment and what it leads ordinary people in the PRC to do. And one of the questions that I have, that I think some of the more nuanced survey data that says, well, if peace could be maintained, would you want Taiwan independence? Without that stipulation, the question about the dual identity and the people who are pragmatists, the question is how much of that is driven by very legitimate and real concerns that the PRC is going to run out of patience, and that if you ask for Taiwan independence or you have a referendum that says that will result in the end of Chinese patience and invasion. And for young people, that can be confounded because not only don't they remember the Taiwan martial law period, but a lot of the younger end of them don't remember Tiananmen, right? They were small children at the time, and they don't have a sense of that, so they may not have the fear of the PRC government. Yet you still have this very real sentiment by ordinary PRC citizens that Taiwan was part of China, that it was torn from it through foreign imperialism, and that China is not whole without that. And that's what I was talking about. I think it's important that ordinary Chinese citizens have a very limited experience for their worldview, and their worldview is primarily based on ideologies and what they get in education and in other kinds of propaganda.
And by the way, what's wrong with the status quo? Why don't we ask when Puerto Ricans would decide to move away the status quo? The status quo is just fine for many people. I think whether the status quo will be, how long will last, actually depends on how long the Chinese economy will continue to grow. Now we estimate about 1 million Taiwanese doing business in Taiwan. That's a scary thought. 1 million people whose paychecks might affect, on average, 4 people's livelihood in Taiwan. That's 4 million people there. Taiwan only has 23 million people. Imagine that Chinese economy continue to grow very quickly. Now we have every week more than 200 direct flights between Taipei and China. So very quickly we might have 2 million Taiwanese doing business. Right? 2 million times 4, that's 8 million. So Taiwan's economy is going to be very quickly integrated into the Chinese economy. Maintaining the status quo will be on everyone's top priority list.
Okay, it's gone 5:30, so I'm going to have to end there. Anybody who has any questions, unless some of our guests have to leave quickly, anybody who has any questions is welcome to come up and ask them directly to our guests. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professors Goldstein, Niou, Greene and Brown for what has been an engaging and interesting event. Thank you very much.